The world had fallen, and America was no longer the land of the free. It had become a land of the dead. A virus, once thought to be contained, had spread like wildfire across the nation, turning millions of Americans into ravenous, flesh-eating monsters. Major cities lay in ruin, their skyscrapers now hollowed-out tombs. The once thriving heart of civilization was but a shadow of its former self. What was left of the human population had fled to the last remaining safe zones, isolated bastions of survival, surrounded by chaos. But even these zones were growing thinner by the day. The infected were relentless, and with every passing moment, their numbers swelled. Among the survivors, there were those who had lost everything, their families, their homes, their lives before the outbreak. There was Mark Bailey, a former police officer who had seen too many good men fall in the fight to hold on to hope. His days now were a blur of scavenging, planning, and fighting. He had learned not to get too close to anyone, to keep his emotions in check. Trust was a luxury in this new world, one that few could afford. Mark had found refuge in a small enclave known as Ashford Haven, a fortified town that had managed to keep the infected at bay for almost a year. But Mark knew it was only a matter of time before the horde found them. Then there was Elena Walker, a nurse who had lost her entire family in the early days of the outbreak. She was tough, resourceful, and unwavering in her determination to help the injured, even when it meant risking her life. But the constant presence of the infected at Ashford Haven had taken its toll on her. The walls of the safe zone, once a symbol of hope, had become a prison. Elena had a fire in her that could not be extinguished. She wanted to fight back, wanted to do something more than just hide behind walls and wait for the end. And she wasn't alone. There were others, people like Thomas Reed, a mechanic who had become an expert in making weapons from scavenged materials, and Carla Diaz, a former soldier who had seen combat in the most dangerous of places. Together, they formed an unlikely team. But even as they strengthened the defenses of Ashford Haven, they knew it wouldn't be enough. One fateful evening, the calm was shattered. The walls of Ashford Haven were breached. The horde had found them, and they had come in numbers beyond what anyone had anticipated. The first wave came in the night, a silent rush of bodies crashing against the gates. It was as though the infected had learned how to adapt, how to organize, how to strategize. They didn't just stumble mindlessly toward the barricades, they came in waves, testing the defenses, probing for weaknesses. It was terrifying. These creatures, once mindless, had evolved in ways that made them more dangerous than anyone had ever thought possible. Mark had been on watch when the first screams rang out. He had always trusted his instincts, and they told him something was wrong the moment the wind shifted. He grabbed his rifle and rushed to the eastern wall, the source of the noise. The moonlight revealed a horrifying sight, hundreds of zombies, their bodies mangled but moving with unnerving purpose. They clawed at the gates, pulling at the chain links with a ferocity Mark had never seen before. The survivors inside Ashford Haven were already mobilizing, rushing to the armory, gathering weapons, and organizing into defense groups. But there was panic in the air, a sense of helplessness as the gates groaned under the weight of the relentless onslaught. "Get to the armory. We need to hold them off," Mark barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic. Elena, who had been tending to the wounded, quickly joined him, her face grim but resolute. "We can't hold them off for long," she said, her voice tight with fear. "We need a plan. Something that can buy us more time." Thomas, who had already been outside working on makeshift weapons, joined them. His face was streaked with dirt, but his eyes were sharp. "I've been working on something," he said, holding up a crude, flamethrower-like device. "It's not much, but it'll burn them out. We can use it to slow them down at the gates." Carla, the soldier, arrived next, her rifle slung over her shoulder. "The perimeter's compromised," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "We need to get the civilians to the emergency shelter, now." But before they could act, a loud crash echoed from the east. The gates had finally given way. The zombies surged forward in a wave of decayed flesh and snarling mouths, their hunger driving them into the heart of Ashford Haven. The survivors scrambled to fight back, but they were outnumbered. Mark fired into the throng, his heart pounding in his chest. Elena ran past him, pulling a terrified family toward the nearest shelter. Thomas lit his makeshift flamethrower, sending a stream of fire at the oncoming horde, pushing them back, but only temporarily. Carla set up a defensive position, her rifle popping in rapid succession, each shot bringing down another of the infected, but it wasn't enough. The tide of zombies was relentless. As the night wore on, the battle seemed hopeless. Mark fought beside his friends, his muscles aching, his mind focused solely on survival. But in the midst of the chaos, there was a fleeting moment of clarity. Something wasn't right. The infected were attacking with too much coordination. It was as though they were being led, guided by some unseen force. Mark's eyes scanned the mass of zombies, and that's when he saw it, a figure in the distance, standing tall among the chaos, seemingly unaffected by the slaughter around him. A man, or at least someone who looked like a man, moved with purpose through the horde, directing them like a conductor leading an orchestra. Mark's blood ran cold. They weren't just fighting the infected anymore. They were fighting something far worse. The first light of dawn barely broke through the smoke-filled sky, casting a grim glow over the battlefield. Ashford Haven was in chaos. The zombies had flooded the town, overrunning the outer walls and spilling into the narrow streets. The survivors fought desperately, but the odds were stacked against them. Mark Bailey's hands were slick with sweat as he loaded his rifle, his mind racing. They needed a plan, something to turn the tide. But what? They couldn't rely on firepower alone. It was clear now that the infected weren't just mindless creatures, they were being led. And that was something Mark had never encountered before. Mark kept his eyes on the figure he'd spotted in the chaos, a tall, lean man who moved with an unnatural calm. He weaved through the mass of zombies, directing them, guiding them with precise gestures. It was as if he was in control, manipulating the horde like a puppet master. The man's eyes were cold, calculating, and he didn't seem to care about the carnage surrounding him. He was the source of this madness, and Mark knew that if they didn't stop him, Ashford Haven would fall. "Elena!" Mark shouted, his voice hoarse from the tension. He could barely hear himself over the gunfire and the shrieks of the infected. Elena was on the front lines, pulling injured civilians into the makeshift medical tents. She looked over at him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "We have to get to the man leading them," Mark said, his voice urgent. "He's the key to all of this. If we take him down, maybe we can stop the horde." Elena's brow furrowed, but she nodded quickly. She knew he was right. It was the only chance they had left. "Carla!" Elena called, looking for the former soldier. "We need to move, now." Carla appeared from behind a wrecked vehicle, her expression a perfect mask of focus. "I've been covering the east side," she said, slinging her rifle over her shoulder. "What's the plan?" "Elena and I are going after the leader," Mark said, his voice grim. "You cover us. Make sure no one gets in our way." Carla nodded without hesitation, and the three of them sprinted toward the center of the town, weaving through the debris and wreckage. The streets were littered with fallen survivors and the undead, many of them stumbling over the bodies of their own kind. Mark's heart raced in his chest as they neared the place where he had last seen the figure. But the closer they got, the more they realized how well coordinated the horde had become. It wasn't just random chaos anymore. The zombies were working together, organizing themselves into groups, some blocking alleyways, others moving as if they knew exactly where to go. "This isn't just an attack. It's an invasion," Elena muttered, her voice tight with dread. "They're trying to take Ashford Haven for something else." Mark didn't reply. His thoughts were consumed by the man they were chasing. Whoever he was, he had found a way to control the infected, to turn them into a weapon. If they didn't stop him now, there would be no safe place left in America. They reached the heart of the town, where the figure stood motionless in the middle of a street, surrounded by zombies. But unlike before, he wasn't simply guiding them, he was speaking to them. The horde didn't just move with their usual mindless aggression. Now they were still, as if listening. The man raised his hands slowly, and the infected parted, clearing a path. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. The figure wasn't just a leader. He was something more. Something otherworldly. "That's him," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. Carla motioned for them to follow. She'd moved up ahead, taking position behind a pile of rubble, where she could cover them. Elena and Mark crept forward, staying low to the ground, hearts pounding. They had to reach him before the horde reacted. If they failed, the entire enclave would be lost. As they neared, Mark's pulse raced with a cold sense of dread. There was something wrong with the man. His movements were smooth, unnatural, and the way he interacted with the infected felt too familiar. The zombies didn't attack him, they surrounded him like worshippers around a deity. "Elena, stay sharp," Mark muttered. "This isn't just a human anymore." They stopped a few feet away, hidden in the shadows of a ruined building. The man stood still, his eyes closed, as though he was in some trance. He was taller than Mark, dressed in a long, dark coat that fluttered slightly in the wind, though the air was still. His face was pale, almost as if it had been drained of color, but his eyes, when they opened, were unnaturally bright, glowing faintly. Suddenly, the man spoke. His voice was soft, yet it cut through the noise like a blade. "You think you can stop this? You're too late. The new world is already here." Mark froze. The words felt like an electric shock coursing through his veins. There was something almost prophetic about the way he spoke. It wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. Elena glanced at Mark, her face filled with both fear and resolve. "What is he?" "I don't know," Mark replied, his mind racing. "But we're about to find out." Before they could act, the figure turned toward them, his glowing eyes locking with Mark's. For a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. It was as if time slowed, and the world around them turned to static. The man smiled, an eerie, cold smile, and then he raised his hands toward the sky. The ground shook beneath them. It wasn't an earthquake, but something else, something unnatural. The infected around them began to grow restless, their bodies jerking, twitching, as though responding to some unseen force. "We're running out of time," Mark said urgently, pulling Elena back into cover. "We need to take him down now, before he turns the entire town into an army." But it was already too late. The man had seen them, and now they were his next targets. The final battle for Ashford Haven was about to begin. The air around Ashford Haven had thickened, heavy with the weight of impending doom. The zombies, once aimless creatures driven solely by hunger, now seemed eerily coordinated, responding to the invisible influence of the man they had been following. Their movements were deliberate, synchronized, as if the boundaries between the dead and the living had blurred into something far darker. Mark, Elena, and Carla huddled behind the crumbling remnants of a nearby building, watching the man, this mysterious figure, who seemed to command the horde with a mere gesture. The ground trembled again, sending a ripple through the mass of infected. The man's smile widened, his glowing eyes flickering with an unnatural intensity. His voice carried on the wind, soft but chilling, like a whispered command. "They believe in me," he murmured, barely above a whisper, as though speaking to no one but the dead. "They know I will bring about the rebirth of this world. You cannot stop what has already begun." Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The figure wasn't just controlling the zombies, he was commanding them with a kind of sick reverence, as though the infected weren't mindless beasts anymore but followers, disciples of some grotesque new order. "This is madness," Elena muttered, her voice barely audible. She gripped her rifle tightly, her knuckles turning white. We're not fighting the undead anymore. We're fighting something else. Something worse. Mark's mind raced. He had heard rumors about the infected adapting, becoming more than just mindless creatures, but this was something else entirely. This man was not just a leader of the dead, he was somehow tied to them, fused with them in a way that made him more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. We can't fight him directly, not like this, Carla whispered, her eyes narrowing. We need to take out the source. Whatever he's using to control them, that's the key. Mark nodded. We'll need a distraction. Something big. The infected were swarming around the man now, waiting for his next command, but he seemed content to watch the chaos unfold. It was almost as if he was reveling in his power, savoring the moment of absolute control. For a brief second, Mark saw a flash of something in the man's eyes, something darker, like he was watching the world burn and enjoying every minute of it. We don't have much time, Elena said urgently. We need to move now, before he realizes we're here. Carla took a deep breath, glancing around for any possible advantage. I'll lay down cover fire, she said, determination set in her voice. You two go for him. I'll keep the horde off your back as best I can. Mark nodded, grateful for her level-headedness. We'll need to get close, he said, checking his gear. Once we're in range, I'll fire on him. But we have to make sure he doesn't get a chance to retaliate. Elena's gaze flickered over the scene, her mind already formulating a plan. We'll move in from the west side, stay low, and take him by surprise. If we can disorient him, maybe we can take him down. Mark gave her a look. That's risky. He'll notice us before we get too close. I don't care, Elena replied, her voice firm. This is our only shot. We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for everyone still alive in this place. The longer we wait, the more of them he'll control. Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't like the idea of rushing in blindly, but Elena was right. This was their only chance. All right, he said, his voice low and steady. We move on my count. Carla, when we start, keep your fire tight. No wasted shots. We need to focus on him, not the horde. Carla gave him a sharp nod. Understood. They waited for the right moment, watched as the figure raised his arms again, as if in some sort of ritual. The zombies around him responded, shifting and groaning in unison, closing in on the walls of Ashford Haven. They were tightening the noose. Mark could feel the pressure building, a sense of urgency that cut through the haze of fear and desperation. It was now or never. Now! Mark hissed, and the trio sprang into action. They dashed across the ruined streets, staying low and moving fast. The sounds of battle echoed behind them, gunshots, screams, and the growls of the infected. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as they approached the figure. He could see him more clearly now, standing tall in the midst of the chaos, exuding a dark charisma that seemed to pull the horde toward him. The man's eyes never wavered from the mass of zombies, but Mark could sense he was aware of their approach. There was a shift in the air, a stillness that settled over the battlefield like a storm before the rain. Get ready, Mark muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. We take him out now, before he sees us. They reached the edge of the mob, close enough to strike but far enough to still be hidden in the shadows. The man's back was to them, his attention focused on directing the horde, but Mark didn't trust the gap they had. He knew better than to assume the enemy wouldn't notice them. He motioned for Elena to stay back, then he signaled to Carla, who was positioned a few yards ahead. The moment Carla fired, a single, powerful shot rang out, cutting through the silence like a bullet of lightning. The blast struck the ground near the man's feet, sending a plume of dust into the air. It wasn't a shot meant to kill, but a signal. A distraction. The infected paused, their attention shifting for just a split second, giving Mark and Elena the opening they needed. They moved swiftly, closing the distance between them and the figure. Mark felt his pulse quicken as they crept closer, the sounds of the horde's groans filling the air. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. Mark's eyes narrowed. There was something about him, something deeply unsettling. He was too calm, too in control. And then, without warning, the figure spun around, his eyes locking onto Mark's with a chilling certainty. "You think you can stop me?" the man's voice echoed, smooth and deadly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "You are already too late." Before Mark could react, the ground beneath them shook again. The horde surged forward, almost as if on command. The figure had anticipated them, and now the real fight was about to begin. The ground trembled violently beneath their feet as the horde, now fully under the control of the figure, surged forward like a tidal wave. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. The plan had gone sideways in an instant. The man, this thing, was far more dangerous than anything they had imagined. Elena cursed under her breath as she dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the first wave of infected that came charging toward them. The zombies moved with a terrifying precision, their bodies jerking as if in unison, eyes vacant but driven by some sinister force. Mark gritted his teeth and turned toward the figure, who stood motionless, his cold, glowing eyes locked on them. The eerie calmness in his posture only amplified the sense of dread that clawed at Mark's gut. "You cannot stop it," the figure said again, his voice resonating with a strange finality. He didn't raise a hand or speak an incantation. His mere presence seemed to command the horde, the infected halting their attack for a moment, waiting, as if anticipating his next order. Mark had to act, and fast. "Elena, move!" Mark shouted, as he raised his rifle, taking aim at the figure. But before he could fire, something unexpected happened. The man raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and the entire horde seemed to pause. For a moment it was as though the infected were frozen in place, an unnatural stillness falling over the battlefield. The figure's eyes flashed with an eerie light, and Mark felt a wave of intense pressure, like something heavy pushing down on him, causing his breath to catch in his throat. It wasn't just his control over the zombies that was terrifying, it was his ability to manipulate the environment itself. Mark's vision blurred slightly as if reality itself was distorting around him, the air thickening with an unnatural weight. His body felt sluggish, like he was trying to move through molasses. "Elena!" Mark gasped, struggling to break free from the suffocating pressure. His hands trembled as he lowered his rifle, unable to hold on to it. But Elena was already on the move, her instincts kicking in as she darted toward the figure. Her rifle was aimed at the man, her resolve hardening with every step. But the closer she got, the stronger the oppressive force became. It felt like the air itself was alive, pushing back against her with every movement. The figure smiled, the expression devoid of warmth, as he lowered his hand. His voice echoed again, deep and resonant. "You're too weak to understand, too small to stop what's coming," he intoned, his words carrying a haunting certainty. "This world is dying, and I am its rebirth. These creatures you call zombies, this is merely the beginning. You should have joined me." Mark's fingers tightened around his rifle, the weight of his limbs finally starting to lift. He knew they were running out of time. They couldn't let him finish whatever ritual he was beginning, whatever power he was calling upon. But in the back of his mind, Mark realized they had been playing into the man's hands. Everything he had done, everything he had orchestrated, had been with the intent of drawing them out. He knew they would try to stop him. "Elena!" Mark called out again, his voice hoarse. "We need to distract him. Focus on the horde, keep him from focusing on us." Elena nodded sharply, her face set in grim determination. She turned and fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed across the broken streets, snapping the infected out of their stupor. The horde lurched forward, tearing through the space between Mark, Elena, and the figure. For a moment, the zombies lost their precision, stumbling and clashing against each other as they moved toward the new target, the survivors. Mark's heart hammered as he saw the opening. Elena immediately took cover behind a ruined car, providing support fire as Mark sprinted toward the man, his eyes locked onto the figure's cold, calculating expression. He had to get close enough to land a shot. The figure seemed to sense his approach. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a wave of energy rippling through the air, slamming into Mark with the force of a battering ram. Mark was knocked off his feet, tumbling headfirst into the dirt. His rifle flew from his hands, sliding across the ground just out of reach. Pain exploded in his chest as he struggled to catch his breath, his vision dimming. "Elena," he shouted, his voice a rasp. But Elena was engaged with the horde, holding them back with disciplined bursts of gunfire, trying to prevent them from swarming the area. The figure approached slowly, his movements almost casual, as if he had all the time in the world. Mark's eyes burned with fury as he pushed himself to his feet, barely able to stay upright. His body felt as if it were on fire, every muscle aching from the unnatural pressure the figure had exerted. "You think you can stop me?" the man taunted, his voice now laced with mocking amusement. "You don't even know what you're up against." Mark's fingers brushed the ground and found his rifle. He pulled it closer, the weight of the weapon familiar, a last lifeline in this nightmare. He was weakened, but not broken. There had to be a way. There had to be a way to defeat this. He fired a shot, wild, instinctive, but it was enough to draw the figure's attention for just a fraction of a second. That second was all Mark needed. The figure flinched as the bullet grazed his shoulder. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it was enough to make him hesitate, if only for a heartbeat. Mark took a deep breath, gathering what little strength he had left. With his vision still swimming, he aimed once more, and this time, he fired directly at the man's head. But the shot never reached its mark. Instead, the figure raised both hands, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. A blast of dark power surged from him, sending an explosion of force through the streets. Mark was thrown backward, slamming into the side of a collapsed building. His body felt like it was on fire, every muscle protesting against the impact. Blood dripped from his forehead, and his vision blurred even further. Through the haze of pain, Mark realized something: this man wasn't just controlling the zombies. He was a conduit for something far older, far more dangerous. This was no ordinary leader. This was something else entirely. A voice, low and dark, echoed in Mark's mind, as if the figure's power was beginning to seep into his very thoughts. "You cannot fight what has already begun." But even as Mark's world started to slip into darkness, a single thought burned in his mind: they couldn't lose. Not like this. The battle was far from over, and there was still a chance to end it. He just had to survive long enough to find it. The world around Mark blurred into an indistinct smear of pain and darkness as his mind struggled to hold on to consciousness. His body felt like it was made of lead, every inch of him screaming with the aftereffects of the blast. The ground under him was cold, the harsh wind biting at his skin. His breaths were shallow and ragged, but there was something else, a tingling, a faint hum in the air. The figure, the one pulling the strings behind the infected, was still out there, his power looming like a storm cloud. Mark tried to focus, but his vision kept fading in and out. A dull ringing filled his ears, making it impossible to hear the chaos around him. The sounds of the horde were distant now, muffled as though they were in another world. His head throbbed, and the metallic taste of blood lingered in his mouth. He had to get up. He had to fight. A shadow appeared in front of him, blocking out the gray sky. It was Elena. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes burned with determination. "Mark," she said urgently, her voice low, "you've got to get up. We can't let him win." Mark barely heard her words over the pounding in his skull, but her hands were pulling him up, steadying him. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the dizziness. His body was weak, but his resolve was still intact. They couldn't let this monster take over. Ashford Haven, everything they'd fought for, was on the verge of being wiped out. "Elena, we need to stop him," Mark rasped, wiping the blood from his forehead with the back of his hand. His fingers felt numb, but he gripped her arm to steady himself. He's not human. I think he's using them." "He's not just using them, Mark," Elena interrupted, her voice steady but laced with fear. "He's become them. Something about him, it's like he's merging with the Horde. I think they're all connected to him now. It's like he's become their leader in every way, asterisk in their minds, asterisk." Mark's eyes widened. "So, it's not just control. It's symbiosis? A kind of merging?" Elena nodded grimly. "Exactly. That's why we can't stop him the same way we'd fight a normal leader. He's more than just a man. He's like a conduit for whatever power is driving this." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. Every part of him screamed to sit down, to rest, but he couldn't. Not now. They were losing. I think I know what we have to do." He pushed through the fog in his head, trying to form a plan. The images of the figure's glowing eyes, the unnatural calm with which he commanded the undead, haunted him. "We need to sever the connection. Whatever he's using to control them, that's our key. If we destroy that link, we might be able to kill two birds with one stone." "But how?" Elena asked, her voice tight with desperation. "How do we destroy something like that?" "I don't know yet," Mark admitted, feeling the weight of their situation crushing down on him. But there was one thing he did know: they couldn't keep playing by the same rules. The old ways of fighting the infected, guns, fire, barricades, weren't going to work. This was different. It was something else. Mark glanced around. The streets were crawling with the Horde. But as his eyes fell on the figure again, standing, waiting, like a statue in the midst of the chaos, something in him clicked. He saw it now, clear as day. The figure wasn't just standing there. He was absorbing the chaos around him, using it as fuel to amplify his power. The infected were no longer just pawns. They were extensions of his will. "The energy," Mark muttered to himself, as a thought began to take root. "He's channeling the energy from them." Elena caught his eye. "What do you mean?" "The zombies, they're not just mindless creatures," Mark said, shaking his head, his voice rising with the realization. "Their fuel, his power comes from them. He's using their life force, or whatever is left of it, to amplify his own abilities." "That's insane," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "So if we kill the infected, we cut off his power?" Mark nodded. "Exactly. We need to eliminate enough of the Horde to weaken him." "But," he trailed off, his mind racing. "We don't have much time before he realizes what we're doing. He's already too aware of us." "Then we'll have to work fast," Elena said, her face hardening with resolve. "We'll take out as many as we can, together. We'll draw him out." Carla's voice rang out from behind them. "Not so fast." Mark turned to see the former soldier emerging from behind a broken-down truck. Her face was grim, her uniform covered in grime, but she was standing tall, rifle in hand. "Carla," Mark said with a sigh of relief, "you're still in one piece." "For now," Carla replied dryly. "But I've been listening to your plan, and I have a better idea." "What's that?" Mark asked, his patience thinning. "We're not going to take out the Horde piece by piece. We'll get to the heart of it." Carla's eyes were cold, focused. "The thing controlling them. We take that out, and the rest will crumble." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "You mean the figure himself?" "Exactly," Carla said, stepping forward with a determined look. "We cut off the head. That's how we win. We hit him directly. We don't waste time fighting the zombies. We go straight for him." Mark considered her words. It was risky, but it was the kind of gamble they had to take. If they could draw the man into a vulnerable position and catch him off guard, they might stand a chance. But Carla wasn't done. "We'll need a distraction," she said. "Something to get him to focus on us, not on the zombies. We can't approach him head-on. Not with him in control of the horde." Mark's eyes narrowed. "A distraction?" Carla nodded. "I've been working on something. A little bomb, made from some of the explosives we found in the armory. Enough to shake things up." Mark's lips curled into a grim smile. "I like the sound of that." "Good," Carla said, her expression hardening. "But we have to move fast. The longer we wait, the more he'll have time to reinforce his control." "All right," Mark said, taking a deep breath. "We'll execute the plan. Elena and I will provide the cover fire. Carla, you set up the bomb, and once it goes off, we move in." They shared a final glance, each of them knowing that this could be their last chance to stop the nightmare that had unfolded. "We do this together," Elena said quietly. Mark nodded, clenching his fists. "Together." With one last look at the figure in the distance, still watching, still waiting, the three of them sprinted toward their final confrontation, hoping the odds were in their favor. The battle for Ashford Haven was far from over, but the fight for humanity's survival had just entered its most dangerous phase yet. The moment Mark, Elena, and Carla split up, the air seemed to hum with anticipation. The wind carried the stench of decay, thick and cloying, while the ground beneath their boots trembled with the distant, rhythmic march of the infected. Mark could feel the weight of every step, the knowledge that time was running out pressing down on his chest. If they didn't succeed, Ashford Haven, what was left of it, would fall. Everything they had fought for, everything they had survived, would be erased in a matter of hours. Carla was the first to vanish into the shadows, her silhouette disappearing behind the wreckage of an overturned bus. She was the wild card, the unpredictable force that could either save them or get them killed. Mark trusted her, though. He had seen her do the impossible too many times. Now, it was their turn to do the same. Mark and Elena moved toward the east side of the wrecked city, hugging the walls of shattered buildings for cover. The streets ahead were cluttered with the remains of the last human defenses, burned-out vehicles, broken barricades, and the faint remnants of abandoned weapons. It was eerily quiet now, almost as if the infected had been waiting for them to make their move. The tension was palpable, the stillness oppressive. Mark's breath was steady, controlled, though every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to run, to get out before it was too late. "Do you think it'll work?" Elena whispered, her voice low as they crouched behind a stack of debris, scanning the area. Mark's eyes flicked to her, then back to the figure in the distance. The man, no, whatever he was now, stood at the center of a growing sea of zombies. They encircled him like worshippers, waiting for his command. He was their king, their god, and his eyes burned with an intensity that made Mark's skin crawl. "It has to," Mark replied, his voice tight. He adjusted his grip on his rifle. "We have to hit him hard and fast. If we can draw him out, break his focus for just a moment, we can end this." Elena nodded, her lips pressed into a grim line. "I hope you're right." There was no more time for planning. No more time for second-guessing. The entire future of their world hinged on this final confrontation. They couldn't afford to fail. A few yards ahead, Carla's silhouette reappeared. She was crouched low, moving silently among the ruins, a bundle of explosives strapped to her back. She gave them a quick nod as she passed, signaling that she was in position. Mark's pulse quickened. The countdown had begun. Mark and Elena continued to move, inching closer to their target. The figure remained still, unaware of their presence. Every step felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on their shoulders. Mark's heart hammered in his chest, but his mind stayed focused, laser-sharp. He didn't dare take his eyes off the figure. Then, suddenly, the ground began to shake again. The figure raised his arms, his eyes glowing with that same unnerving intensity. The horde began to stir, their movements now more coordinated, more deliberate. They knew what to do without a single spoken word. It was as if they were extensions of his will, following his every command without question. Mark's grip tightened on his rifle. This was it. Move! Mark hissed, and in an instant, they were in motion. Elena sprinted forward, cutting to the left, while Mark flanked right. Their goal was simple: draw the figure's attention away from Carla, who was still setting up the bomb. A distraction. A chance for Carla to get close enough to finish what she started. The infected began to turn, sensing the movement in the streets. Their eyes flicked toward Mark and Elena, and with a chilling collective growl, they began to shamble forward. Mark fired a shot into the air, the sound echoing through the streets, drawing the horde toward him. The first wave of infected charged, relentless, a mass of flesh and bone hungry for the living. He kept moving, weaving between the wreckage, firing quick bursts at anything that came too close. Elena was beside him, her rifle steady, picking off targets with surgical precision. They were a well-oiled machine, working in tandem, but every moment brought them closer to the horde center. The figure's gaze was still fixed on them, but his attention was now divided. His power was waning, if only for a moment. That was all they needed. Mark saw Carla, crouched behind an old fire truck, her hands working quickly to place the final piece of the explosive. The clock was ticking. The figure's gaze flickered toward her, and Mark's stomach dropped. He had to act fast. "Elena, cover me!" Mark shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the battle. Without hesitation, Elena fired, keeping the zombies at bay as Mark sprinted forward, aiming for the figure. The horde closed in behind him, but the zombies were distracted by Elena's shots. Mark's breath came in ragged bursts as he closed the distance, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't look back. The figure turned his head just as Mark reached the edge of the clearing. Their eyes met, Mark's full of fury and desperation, the figure's cold and knowing, as though he had expected this moment all along. "You're too late," the figure said, his voice a whisper carried on the wind, the words laced with an eerie calmness. Mark raised his rifle, aiming directly at the figure's chest. He didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot missed. The figure's hand shot out, and before Mark could react, he felt a force slam into his chest. The air was knocked from his lungs, and he was thrown backward, landing hard against the ground. Pain exploded through him, but he scrambled to his feet, gasping for breath. The figure stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with dark power. "You think you can stop me? You think you can stop what has already begun?" Mark's fingers clenched around his rifle. He couldn't give up. Not now. From behind him, a loud bang shattered the air. The sound was deafening, and the ground seemed to shudder beneath Mark's feet. The figure faltered, his expression twisting in confusion. The blast had shaken the very foundations of the ruined city. Mark's eyes widened in realization. The bomb. Carla had set it off. But it wasn't enough to kill the figure. It had only weakened him, disrupted his connection with the horde. The zombies around them froze, momentarily disoriented, and that was all Mark needed. He pushed himself to his feet, desperation fueling him. "Elena! Now!" Mark screamed, raising his rifle once more. Elena, who had been waiting for the signal, sprinted forward, her rifle aimed at the man's head. The figure's eyes widened in shock, but it was too late. The shot rang out. For a split second, everything stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the figure crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless. The horde around him began to falter, as if the connection that had once bound them together had been severed. They stood motionless for a moment, uncertain. And then, one by one, they collapsed, like marionettes whose strings had been cut. It was over. The battle had been won. But Mark knew this was only a small victory. The world was still in ruins, and the fight for humanity's survival was far from finished. But they had struck a blow, and that was enough, for now. The silence that followed the figure's fall was unlike anything Mark had ever experienced. The Horde, once a relentless and terrifying force, stood still, frozen, motionless, as if waiting for the world to return to some semblance of order. The air was thick with dust, the acrid stench of decay lingering like a fog. For a long moment, Mark could only hear the ragged sounds of his own breathing, the pounding of his heart in his ears. Then, one by one, the zombies began to collapse, some crumpling to the ground, others falling in unnatural heaps, as though their lifeless bodies had forgotten how to move. The chaos that had defined their world was gone in an instant, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a fragile peace, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting to see if it would survive. Mark stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the fallen figure. The once powerful being who had commanded the Horde was now just another body in the wreckage. He had been their greatest threat, the force that had nearly wiped out humanity. But now, he was nothing. His connection to the undead was severed, and without it, they had no direction. But something gnawed at Mark's gut. It wasn't over. Not completely. The figure's death had stopped the Horde, but the infection was still out there. The world was still broken. Elena. Mark called out, his voice hoarse. Carla? Elena emerged from the shadows, her face smeared with dirt and sweat, but her eyes held a faint glimmer of relief. She jogged toward him, her rifle slung over her shoulder. We did it, she said, her voice quiet but steady. He's gone. They're gone. Mark nodded, his throat tight. It feels like a reprieve, not a victory. Elena's eyes softened, but she didn't argue. She understood. The war wasn't over. This was just a battle. Carla appeared next, stepping from behind the wreckage of a nearby building, her movements slow but determined. She gave them a curt nod, the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Looks like we did it, she said, the corners of her mouth turning up in a wry smile. Not bad for a bunch of survivors. Mark let out a shaky breath, his gaze turning back to the sea of fallen zombies. It had been a brutal fight, one that had cost them more than they were willing to admit. But they had come out the other side. They had won. For now. We need to get back to the compound, Mark said, his voice steady now. We don't know how far the infection has spread. There could still be pockets of resistance out there. We need to regroup, make sure the survivors are safe. Elena nodded, scanning the area around them. The streets were eerily quiet now, the only sound the distant creaking of buildings shifting in the wind. I agree. We can't take anything for granted. Carla turned toward them, her expression unreadable. There's something else. We need to talk. Mark's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Carla hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice low. I don't think this was the end. I've been thinking about it, and I don't believe the figure was working alone. There's something bigger at play here. Something we haven't seen yet. Mark frowned. What do you mean? He was the one controlling the Horde. He was the one pulling the strings. Carla shook her head, her eyes sharp. I don't think he was the mastermind. He was a pawn, just like the rest of us. Someone, or something, bigger was behind him. He was merely the vehicle. Mark felt a cold chill run down his spine. You think there's more to this? Much more, Carla replied. And I don't think we're going to like what we find when we dig deeper. Mark exchanged a glance with Elena. They had already lost so much, fought so hard. The last thing they needed was more bad news. But Carla's words hung in the air, undeniable. The figure may have been defeated, but the real danger, whatever it was still lurking out there. We'll figure it out, Mark said, his voice firm. But for now, we get back to the compound. We need to make sure the survivors are safe. That's our priority. Carla nodded, but her expression remained tense. I hope you're right. I hope we've seen the worst of it. But something tells me this is just the beginning. Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. They all knew the truth. The road ahead was uncertain. The fight for humanity's survival had just entered its next phase. Whatever darkness lurked beyond the horizon, they would face it together, stronger for what they had endured. They began to move toward the compound, each of them weighed down by the knowledge that while they had won today, tomorrow was never guaranteed. The world had been shattered, but there was still hope. And as long as they fought, together, they might just have a chance to rebuild. The trip back to the compound was long and grueling. Every step felt like a mile, the journey marked by the haunting remains of a world that had crumbled beneath the weight of the undead plague. There were no words exchanged as they walked. The silence between them was heavy with the aftermath of their victory, tempered by the nagging fear that it wasn't truly over. As they neared the compound's perimeter, Mark could see the makeshift defenses still standing, though battered. The survivors inside had managed to hold their ground, but there was no telling how much longer they could last. The gates were open as they approached, and a few of the sentries waved them in. But there was no celebration, no cheering. The mood was somber, reflective. Inside the compound, the survivors were waiting. The faces of the weary, the broken, and the hopeful turned toward them. Among the group were the families who had managed to escape the worst of the destruction, the soldiers who had fought and bled beside them, and the few lucky enough to have survived the outbreak. But even now, as Mark looked at them, he knew the truth. They had survived the worst, but the nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And as the gates closed behind them, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that whatever came next, they would face it together. Because in this broken world, that was the only thing that mattered. The compound had become a refuge in the midst of chaos, a fragile pocket of humanity desperately holding onto a world that had slipped through their fingers. As Mark stood at the gate, staring out into the darkening sky, he could almost feel the weight of everything pressing in on him. The horde was no longer their biggest threat. It was the unknown. Whatever had fueled the figure's rise, whatever dark power had turned him into a living weapon, it was still out there, waiting. And the more Mark thought about it, the more he realized it was a force they hadn't even begun to understand. Inside the compound, the survivors were gathered in a large, dimly lit room, a makeshift command center, filled with maps, weapons, and quiet conversations. There were no cheers, no celebration, just the sound of exhausted breaths and the rustling of papers. People moved in and out of the room with grim determination, focused on the task at hand. There were still too many unknowns. Mark and Elena made their way to the center of the room, where Carla was already deep in conversation with a few of the senior officers. She looked up as they entered, her face unreadable but her eyes sharp. "They're still processing the bodies," Carla said without preamble. "It's more than just the physical toll. We're finding strange markings on some of the infected. Like symbols, etched into their skin." Mark's brows furrowed. "Symbols?" Carla nodded, her fingers tapping on the map in front of her. "We've seen a few cases of this before, but not to this extent. It's like a network, some kind of pattern. The figure might have been the tip of the iceberg. The real threat might still be hidden beneath the surface." Elena glanced at Mark, her face tight with concern. "What are we talking about? A cult? Some kind of organization?" Carla hesitated. "It's too early to say. But whatever this is, it's bigger than just a virus or a mind control mechanism. There's something ancient about it. Something old." Mark's pulse quickened. "Ancient? What are we dealing with here, Carla?" "I don't know yet," she replied, her voice low. "But I think it's something beyond our understanding. We've seen people change. We've seen them take control. But this, it's like the infection isn't just spreading physically. It's spreading, spiritually. Like it's becoming part of the fabric of everything. The whole world. Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing his eyes as the weight of her words sank in. They had been so focused on surviving that they hadn't thought about the true scope of the infection. It wasn't just a virus, wasn't just a mindless army of undead. This was a force that was changing everything. And if it wasn't stopped soon, it might spread beyond what any of them could contain. We need answers, Mark said, his voice growing more resolute. We need to find the source. The figure was the key, but there's someone, or something, pulling the strings. It might not be a matter of just killing more zombies. This is bigger than that. Carla looked at him for a long moment before speaking. You're right. But the problem is we don't know where to start. We can only go so far with the resources we have here. Mark's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented bits of information they had. There was something deeper at play here, something insidious. The figure had been powerful, but he wasn't acting alone. There had to be a higher force behind all of it, something that had been waiting, watching, and manipulating everything from the shadows. We can't stay here, Mark said finally, his voice hard with determination. We need to go out there. Find more survivors, gather intel. If we're going to stop this, we need to understand what's behind it. And that means taking the fight to whoever, or whatever, is causing this. Elena stepped forward, her eyes never leaving him. You think it's too soon? The survivors are exhausted. They're barely hanging on. We don't have time to wait, Mark replied, meeting her gaze with a certainty that left no room for argument. The longer we sit here, the more time this thing has to spread. We don't know how far it's gone or how deep it's embedded itself into society. If we don't act now, we might lose the last chance we have. Elena paused, her face softening. She understood the gravity of what he was saying. You're right. But we have to be smart about this. We can't afford to take unnecessary risks. Mark nodded. We'll make it work. We'll get the information we need. And when we do, we'll be ready to fight back. Carla leaned forward, her fingers tracing the edges of the map. There's an old military facility a few miles outside the city, she said, her voice low. It was decommissioned years ago, but there are rumors that it might still hold valuable intel, old research, military files, things that could point us in the right direction. It's a long shot, but it's the best lead we've got. Mark's eyes narrowed as he considered the option. How secure is it? Not very, Carla replied, her tone serious. It's a dangerous place. There's a reason it was abandoned in the first place. But if there's anything we can use, it'll be there. Elena crossed her arms, her gaze flicking from Carla to Mark. This is a risky move. We don't know what's waiting for us out there. Mark clenched his fists, his mind made up. We're out of options. If we don't act, we're just waiting to die. We need to take that risk. Carla gave him a sharp nod. I'll start making preparations. We'll need a team, small and mobile, no more than a handful of us. We can't afford to draw attention. Mark glanced around the room at the tired faces of the survivors. Some were resting, others were working in silence, lost in their own thoughts. There was fear in their eyes, but there was also something else, resilience. They were alive. They had fought to survive, and they weren't going to let this new darkness defeat them. We'll leave at first light, Mark said. Get what we need, and then come back. This place can't afford to lose its last fighters. As Mark turned to leave, Elena fell in step beside him. You know it's not just about information, right? The more we learn, the more we might be exposing ourselves to something worse than we can imagine. Mark stopped for a moment, looking out over the compound. The world beyond these walls was a place of nightmares, but inside, they had a chance. "I know," he said softly. "But we can't just wait to die. We have to fight." They shared a long look, and in that moment, both of them understood the weight of the journey ahead. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about stopping the infection before it could consume everything. The quiet of the night enveloped them as they made their way to their quarters. The calm before the storm. Tomorrow, they would venture out into the unknown, hoping to uncover the secrets behind the infection and stop the ancient darkness before it destroyed what was left of humanity. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but one thing was clear: they were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting for the future. And they would do whatever it took to protect it.